Illness and Cure, Chapter 8. Janus and the Concept of Ambivalence. The concept that man's feeling and thinking are built on contrasting and often opposing principles is a very old one and is called ambivalence or inner polarity. It permeates every Eastern philosophy. This mythological idea finds its culmination in the Roman god's Janus, the two-faced deity. The Ark of Janus was the Forum Romanum, the place where the suburban roads entered the city of Rome. The opening of the entrance of the Forum Romanum meant war. The closing of the door signified peace in the Romanian Empire. In ancient times, where art, religion, and science were one and the same expression of man's pondering about nature and the universe, man still had the gift of being able to decipher in grandiose intuitive symbols the essence of all that touched his mind. The creative artist expressed feelings and thoughts in his work long before the philosopher could find means to express them in words. In ancient times, art was the principal communication of intuitive ideas. Immediate intuitive expression was accepted by the public as speech of the gods. Man's unity of view and understanding vanished as his cultural and technical specialization increased. But it can be extremely useful to return to those ancient archaic intuitive images. For example, the Janus myth provides a background for understanding of man's ambivalence, a word ceaselessly but carelessly used in modern psychology and politics. Usually, by it is meant the inner contrast, antinomies and opposites that beset man, man's inner hesitation and doubt, the contrasting feelings which give pose to his resolute actions in fertile attempts at adaptation to new circumstances. Man's matures very slowly. He is the most dependent animal. A strong ego develops only gradually, and when there is any interruption in or impediment to the process of maturation, a vacillating adjustment remains which physical, biological, and psychological factors combine to keep the ego, the organ of adjustment, weak and subject to continual oscillation. Janus, the deity with two faces, one on each side of the head, is the ancient Roman image which symbolizes the confusing, contrasting aspects in man. Originally, Janus was the god of gates and doors, an expression of its instability and subtle equilibrium of all beginnings. The first hour of the day and the first month after the winter solstice were dedicated to him. We still call the first month of the year January. Janus is the beginning of life, the opener of the gates of the day and the doorkeeper of heaven. We still call our doorkeepers the janitor. In Christian mythology, the double-faced Saint Michael has the role of bookkeeper and a messenger to heaven. The Romans usually picture Janus with a face at both sides of the head because he looked backward and forward. The origin of all things was described to him, the course of time, the change of seasons, the ups and downs of fortune. He was regarded as the god of good beginning. Frazer, in his elaborate studies of anthropology, explains that the very word door may be derived from the word Janus. His two-faced head symbolizes youth, the beginning, the old age, the end. Later, the concept of Janus also acquired the meaning of deceitful double talk. Originally, however, he was adored as the father god. Diana's symbolizing the marriage of several contrasting qualities, fire and water, male and female, the sun and the moon, Dianas and Diana. Janus as a concept represents an attempt to integrate several older tribal images into one figure symbolizing the polarity between man and God. The double-faced head represents, in a psychological sense, the awareness of mysterious contrast in man, that he lives with both God and devil in him. The elect animal who can look backward and forward, of man, the watchman of his own history, and of man, the master of time. The name Janus, Diana, is thought to have the same root as Jonas, Hakon, all meaning originally the great light, the great sun fathering God. In the Oriental culture, the Janus figure is depicted as a male and a female face or being that is half human, half animal, and in all cultures we can find comparable reflections and ponderings about man expressed in the mythological idiom common to the culture of the time. Man's inner experience of being divided and split partially originated from his wonderment about the division of sexes into male and female. An ancient myth holds that once man and woman were not separated, that they were one and undivided being until God separated them. Since then, the ardent urge had existed in man to find his lost counterpart and to merge back into the original oneness, making love is the search for the lost unity. Plato describes in Symposium the same origin of mankind. Man is derived from three sexes: man, woman, and those of the double nature whose name is lost. The primeval androgyne was around. He had 4 heads and 4 feet, 1 head with 2 faces, Janus, looking in opposite directions, 4 ears, and 2 privy members. Because of the terrific strength of this being in their threat to the gods, Zeus cut them into 2. If they continue to be insolent and will not be quiet, I will spread them again and they will hop about on a single leg. Apollo was bidden to heal their wounds, and after the 2 halves wandered about, longing for each other, a continuous looking for the lost part of oneself. Apollo was bidden to heal their wounds, and after the 2 halves wandered about, longing for each other, a continuous looking for the lost part of oneself. The fundamental bisexuality of man is expressed with great clarity by the dual principle of yang and yin in the old Chinese Taoic philosophy, as the battle of Amzud versus Ahiram in the Assyrian interpretation, and as God against devil in the Christian conception. The basic sense of bisexuality and undifferentiated origin has a foundation in objective embryological findings. Jungian psychology speaks of the male amias and the female amia being both living in one and the same person. The yang yin in the Chinese philosophy is the mystic dual principle symbolized by the divided circle. Tajitu, representing the interaction of opposites in nature, the battle of light against darkness. The light portion, yang, means heaven, sun, vigor, male, penetration, dragon, monad, odd numbers. The dark half, yin, represent earth, moon, quiescence, female, absorption, even numbers. Buddha speaks in his language of the 7 opposites of the humanity, being short or long-lived, being sick or well, being ugly or beautiful, being purely endowed or talented, being poor or rich, being low or high, being foolish or wise. The embryo-like forms of the Chinese yin and yang were known in the Japanese mythology as magatamas, the beads of fertility that were used as necklaces as protection against abortion. This ancient prototype of the rosary, symbolizing life and continuity, is still in use. In later Oriental symbolism, we find the concept of sexual polarity expressed in a more delicate and complicated manner by the Japanese happiness gods, Ibusu, the masculine one, amid Daikoku, the feminine counterpart. Both have hermaphroditic aspects, such as are found in several examples of the Romanian culture. The basic concept is that both sexes are intrinsically hermaphroditic. And that the union of both means the final happiness of mankind. Artistic illustration of this bisexual theme abounds. Artistic creation gives direct expression to what the individual unconsciously feels and knows but is unable to express in words. Scientific theory has to rediscover and experience in limited and more sophisticated words what the artistic intuition conceives in a direct revelation. Cause against needles. In our day, many images of man exist. The psychologist looking at man sees manifold contrasting aspects of inherent in human motivation and thinking. That is why he does not want to give just one picture of man, and why, in his method of study, he wants to use several approaches to this goal, understanding of the human mind. These methods follows so to speak, the multiple tool theory of historical and clinical research, based on the belief that by approaching a problem from many angles and with various methods, we have greater chances of finding and grasping essential core. Only after such a diversity of approaches and search for multiple causation has been applied does the process of integration of different aspects of man start. In conceptual thinking, the battle about inherent contrast is a very old one. In ancient Greece, we find this controversy expressed in the antinomy between the two dominant medical schools, the one from the Isle of Kos and the other from the town of Knidos. The school of Kos emphasized that there was only the individual sick man to be treated, man in all his varieties of misery. Knidos emphasized the disease, viewing it as the intruder from the outside that had to be chased away. Kos emphasized the study of individual health. Knidos studies its antinomy and disease. Kos emphasized the study of individual health. Knidos studied its antinomy, the disease, pain, and suffering. Knidos studied its antinomy, the disease, pain, and suffering. Through the ages, we find this theoretical battle ranging about which is more important, the deceased, the sick man in his individual singularity, or the disease, the separate morbid entity subservient to general rules of pathology. Originally, the Hippocratic school from Kos, with its biographical and historical approach, was more honored, while in our day, the generalizing school from the Knidos, under the Asclepius and the Euryphon, with its notion of separate diseases, find unwittingly many more followers. Yet, we find when we look at the Hippocrates and his emphasis on the clinical observation, that is, on clinical trial, error and correction, an attempt to integrate both aspects of investigation, the search for the unique individuality and the search for general rules. This giant of medicine, so much more aware than we are of confusing clinical methodology, says in one of his later books on ancient medicine that the physician in his wish to cure must always work with the unfinished body of knowledge, and that both the general disease and the deceased individual should be observed. According to him, life is a continual experiment. This antithetic thinking is expressed in the symbol of medical art, the staff of Almachius, the so-called cardiacis. The snake winding around a phallus-like staff symbolizes fertility and long life, magic bliss and immortality. The snake connotes life, the womb, which is snake-like movements at birth, and at the same time, the symbol of the dangerous serpent. Modern psychiatry and especially psychosomatic disease believe that they have found a happy synthesis of this old theoretical medical contrast. The subtlety of subjective feeling and thinking in both patient and physician is acknowledged. The so-called objective causal factors are studied besides man's various subjective responses towards them. The moment the physician accepts the existence of a unique, individual deceased man not fitting into any classification, he has to be not only a classifier of natural phenomena, but a sympathetic psychologist and a philosopher as well. He not only studies the disease as a circumscribed clinical entity, but he has to ask himself what the sick person is doing with his disease. He even has to ask whether the inner goal and the symptoms may be in the service of psychiatry. More than general medicine, has to be aware of this many-sided approach to the science and man. Though it submits itself to objective methods of research and recognizes the need to reduce phenomena to general rules, at the same time, it has to be aware that it is also an historical science with its own case histories and its own so-called idiographic methods to describe exactly the unique occurrences. Inadequate awareness of such concept may either lead to confusion or into inbreeding of knowledge, in which only the investigatory approach is used, namely that of the conforming, self-righteous community of scientists speaking one and the same language and swearing by one and the only method. Even physicists no longer subscribe to one-sided approach. According to Max Bohr's principle of contemporarity, even the rather simple basic phenomena of physics can be viewed from the diverse standpoints. Different and seemingly contrasting concepts may be needed to describe the same physical phenomena. We cannot measure, for instance, at one and the same time both the passion and the velocity of a particle. Niels Bohr ascribed to the dual nature of electrons. For the explanation of the behavior of electrons, both the static concept of particle and the dynamic concept of wave may be useful. Complementarity means the different and the mutually exclusive but equally truthful observation can be made of one and the same physical occurrence. In every theory is contained the diversity of the observing mind, the limitation of its tools, and finally, the characteristics of that which is looked at. Multiple explanations are even more probable in the instance of complicated psychological and social interactions of man, because here we are dealing not only with generalizing rules but also with the investigation of historical coincidences and unique occurrences in the individual. Only various approaches, views, and concepts can contribute to better understanding, and we shall be able to integrate the various views only when the psychology is able to translate and adequately integrate the differences in scientific terms and the semantic approach becomes available. Psychiatry ambivalence. The psychiatric concept of ambivalence was first developed by the Swiss psychiatrist Breuer, who noted how often contrasting feelings were expressed nearly simultaneously by mentally sick patients, for instance, the synchronous laughing and crying. He distinguished an emotional ambivalence in which opposite feelings confuses man's emotional investment, an ambivalence of will and actions, also called antidependence, in which people seldom can do what they intend to do because of the clash of the inner motivations, and the intellectual ambivalences caused by interfering counter-thoughts, inhibiting or neutralizing any form of creative thinking. Subsequently, Freud enlarged on those concepts. Psychoanalytic theory offers several approaches to the understanding of such inner doubt, confusion, and ambivalence. At first, innate biological bisexuality was seen as the root of ambivalence and polarity. Not only is there an embryologic anatomical basis of this bisexuality, male and female hormones are, for instance, circulating in every human being, but every child has both a father and a mother to identify with. A dominant inner parental picture may interfere with adequate development. The boy who remains too much identified with his mother will develop female qualities. For example, later, the Freudian concept of ambivalence was simplified and brought back to the mere fundamental dualistic and metaphysical viewpoint of the contrasting between anabolic and the catabolic processes, between the life and death instincts struggling in man. Others brought man's inner polarity back to the strange dichotomy between subject and object, or between feeling and thinking. It is sufficient to realize that various polarity can be accused of causing man's hesitation. In psychoanalytic and general psychiatric literature, we find that authors repeatedly refer to ambivalence, quoting Freud's and Breuer's writing, but a little systematic investigation of this basic concept has been made. Unfortunately, personal ambivalences, the prevalence of contrasting and even hostile feelings, tends to confuse many of the scientist's mind. The scholar's personal emotion may lead him to very dogmatic approaches to other theories. We find highly ambivalent, even hostile opinion and feeling expressed about colleagues, just as much engaged in research designed to enrich the fundamental knowledge of man. Orthodoxy and non-orthodoxy fight each other as if these archaic, dogmatic attitudes were part of the scientific equipment. Fantasized theory battles with scientific discipline, semantic confusion with conceptual ignorance, explanation compulsion with skeptic restraint, intuition with factual description. Behind all this theoretical confusion lies the penetrating question as to whether the structure of general method of our thinking corresponds sufficiently to the nature of what we are investigating. Behind all this theoretical confusion lies the penetrating question to whether the structure and the general method of our thinking correspond sufficiently to the nature of what we are investigating. What are our limitations? What do we omit? Ambivalences and polarity. A definition and exact description of the concept of ambivalence or inner polarity are difficult to give because in studying phenomena of ambivalence, we usually experience the interplay of various contrasting aspects and the dual tendencies in what we observe. Perhaps it will be better to speak of the prevalent feelings instead of ambivalence, as various components build up our final feeling. The allegedly opposing feelings of love and hate are in their development quite distinguished from the aforementioned. The allegedly opposing feelings of love and hate are in their development quite distinguishable from the aforementioned male and female polarity. The interaction between instinctual drives and their controlling and inhibiting defense mechanisms, though also contrasting in their action, must be regarded quite differently. In order to cope with the semantic dilemma and confusion of opposite forces and tendencies, I propose to consider man's contrasting interaction of different levels of clinical investigation, delaying the question as to what extent we can relate and investigate these different polarities. Central in the analysis of the various interacting feelings that are active in the mind-body unit stands man's concept of harmony, of equilibrium and equanimity, of a strong individual stable unit. Though there may be contrasting tendencies living in man, the idea is that a gradual integration of the inner antimonies is possible. The biological concept of homeostasis is assumed to have its counterpart in the psychic homeostatic mechanism which enable man to face the challenges of life. When either the physical or the psychic homeostatic forces fail, man grows ill. Concepts such as synthesis, integration, and homeostasis are also linked to the mysterious, spontaneous biological processes of regeneration and immunity. Whenever disruptions of functions takes place, spontaneous synthesis and regenerations occur. Even when an individual is dying, locally the little wounds, as, for instance, one caused by an injection, heal. I propose now that the reader consider with me the manifold contrasting components that direct a man's life and often lead him astray. We may here distinguish 4 different fields of influences joining in the counterpart of ambivalence and bipolarity. In the physical and the biological, the psychological and the social, in each of these fields contrasting influences can be shown which give rise to the man's vacillation. In each of these fields contrasting influences can be shown which give rise to man's vacillations, hesitation, and ambivalence. Though for greater clarity they were treated separately, they are always interconnected. Physical vacillation. Man is not only a spontaneous living thing, he is also subject to the laws of physics and chemistry. Although the field of physics seems to be removed from our subject, it is interesting to observe analogous concept, and even the untrue metaphor may stimulate us to find new rules. True, too, the physicists under the guidance of the new science of cybernetics are more and more intruding into the field of psychology. Physical vacillation. Man is not only a spontaneous living being, he is also subject to the laws of physics and chemistry. Although the field of physics seems far removed from our subject, it is interesting to observe analogous concepts, and even the untrue metaphor may stimulate us to. 2. The physicists under the guidance of the new science of cybernetics are more and more intruding into the field of psychology. They describe historical descriptive methods of valid approach of studying and the uniqueness of occurrences in man, and they want to deliver us psychologists completely to the reducing propositions of physics and chemistry. Freud's fundamental bipolar concept of 2 basic contrasting drives, life versus death instincts, libido contra distrado, is partially founded on the contrast between the rather random existence of the mere physical phenomena and the more intensified structuralization and organization of what is alive. Expressed in terms of physics, we may say that there is an inherent difference between the organized structure intensity and the random capacity of energy. When, for instance, we speak of warmth, the concept of calories connotes the static capacity of energy. The concept of temperature connotes dynamic or kinetic structured intensity of transformable warmth and energy. The concept of intensity always implies a certain order of energy as structuralization. According to the second law of thermodynamics, a continued degradation of intensity takes place in the universe. Lifeless matter tends to decrease in organization and structure. Lifeless matter tends to decrease in organization and structure. Order tends to disappear into a lower order, which may be called a mere thermodynamic equilibrium with its environment. There is no longer intensity or drive. In biological terms, this loss of intensity may be this loss of intensity may be described as a loss of structuralization in analogous psychological terms as a loss of libido. Living things, however, tend to develop higher levels of structuralization, as if life acted against the laws of degradation of intensity. The interaction between structuralization and degradation of intensity can be explained as purely physical phenomena. Another physical analogy of polarity may be found in the study of electricity. One cannot make the electric charge or a magnetic pole without making an equal one of opposite sign somewhere else. Automatic temperature control, adjusting itself to outside circumstances, is a useful device to demonstrate the physical form of vacillating adaptation. In order to adequately control the temperature of a room, we use self-regulating mechanical devices. When the automatic regulator and the negative feedback do not work well, it may become consecutively too hot or too cold in the room, resulting in the apparent fluctuation of temperature. The rules determining this so-called feedback control, comparable to man's ambivalent fluctuation in feelings, are rather well known. First, there must be a neutral regulating organ or device. Second, there must be a measuring and evaluating device, such as the thermostat. Too many evaluative instruments in one circuit may, for instance, break down the entire system. A feedback mechanism with too much time lag results in an unpleasant oscillation of temperature. In such a simple automatic adaptive system of heating the room, comparable with the concept of homeostasis, evaluation, measurement, and time are determining factors for producing a more constant and stable equilibrium. In such a simple automatic adaptive system for heating the room, comparable with the concept of homeostasis, evaluation, measurement, and time are determining factors for producing a more constant and stable equilibrium. Special problems of energy discharge and energy spending come to the fore in such a simple automatic physical device. For instance, in order to get twice the exactitude of measure, one has to invest 4 times the amount of energy used for the regulating device of automatic control. To compare this physical fact with some clinical phenomena expressing rigid automatic control in man, we may say that man's compulsive exactitude and rigidity of adaptation may demand a higher price in energy. Internal automatic control burns a lot of energy. A compulsion tires a man out. Man's bipolar adaptation. Psychologists are on a familiar terrain when they survey some of the biological systems of adaptation. Let us, for the sake of simplicity, define feelings of biological alarm signals helping the living unit in its adaptation to outside influences. Every organism, for instance, has to find its way between opposing sensory warning signals, between temperatures that are too warm or too cold, between stimuli that excite too much or too little, between light that is too bright or too dark, between impressions too painful or not stimulating enough. In lower animal, we speak of adaptation to differently directed tropism. Gradually, the organism, as a result of the process of learning involving memory, repetition, and time, finds a more stable middle road, in form of its own automatic mode of defense and attack. So does the mind, as we shall see later. It is not preposterous to state that, biologically speaking, the first vacillating bipolar feelings form part of the system of trial adaptation between numerous contrasting alarm signals. Until the middle road, an even keel of equanimity is found. Neuropsychologic findings suggest that the organism has different means of adaptation. At birth, the baby has bipolar neural ready to work with. The contrasting action of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system of internal regulation and adaptation come into action. It is not preposterous to state that, biologically speaking, the first vacillating bipolar feelings form part of the system of trial adaptation between numerous contrasting alarm signals until the middle road, and even key to equanimity, is found. Neuropsychological findings suggest that the organism has different means of adaptation. At birth, the baby has polar neural system ready to work with. The contrasting action of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system of internal regulation and adaptation come into action. Via the sensory organs, the newborn mind is opened to more abundant reception of stimuli. In contrast to the constancy of the temperature inside the womb, the child now is exposed to things as either too warm or cold, as signaled to his brain by different neural pathways. Formerly indifferent to temperature, suddenly he moves in a bipolar temperature world. Sometimes contrasting biological systems are at work in the service of human adaptation. The skin, for instance, has such a dual function. It serves as an organ of protection and camouflage, but also able to give alarm signal to fellow creatures. Goose flesh, paleness, fright reactions, and serves thus to be the organ of communication. We are anticipated with functions of hormones and anti-hormones, toxins and antitoxins. Cannon's theory of dual control is based on the facts that led him to develop the concept of homeostasis in the equilibrium between polarity functions. It is important for us to be aware of the fact that the part of man's ambivalent adjustment and his vacillation between opposite tendencies is rooted in innate biological patterns of adaptation. In every organ we can find such ambiguous of actions, even in the highest differentiated functions. Speech, for example, is not only a tool of communication and contact, but also a tool of camouflage and warding off. The holler or the swailer. Man's emotional and behavioral ambivalences begin developing in him from the very moment he is born. But, with its hardened exposure to hostile world of hunger, cold and enforced breathing, invokes numerous biological and psychological reactions. Ambivalence starts at birth. Man wants to escape the womb, yet wants to get back to what theologians call the preambivalent world of oceanic feelings and the naive equanimity. The picture of life in the womb as a lost paradise is part of our common poetic imagery. I realize the semantic confusion possibly inherent in the expression, wants to go back. We must rely here in unconscious biological striving, influenced by the manifold new impression and intrusion into the mind, body, and newborn. It is this ambivalence of birth and hesitation about departure from the womb we find so often expressed in the ancient symbols expressing man in a contrast. Even Buddha is pictured as being born out of the wild serpent, the snake representing the danger and the pangs of birth and the thematic contractions of the womb. Very soon after his physical separation, accompanied by the mental trauma of being torn away by the naive womb world, another separation occurs which is even more significant. The growing awareness of the inner world confronting an outer world, man is no longer at the center point of his biological world. He also lives opposite to the world. He is self-reflecting being. He is also reflective being. He looks at the world. The psychic distance between these two worlds grows with a degree of mental development. We may say that this fundamental antinomy between in and out, between margin and separation, or to express it in more metamorphoric terms, the spirit in the ancient, oceanic, undivided union and participation with the mother incites various defense reactions to repair the symbiotic isms and to bring these two separated worlds together again. Some babies never outgrow their symbiotic coexistence with their mother. Various psychiatric processes try to bridge the growing gap. The psychic process of allusion, introjection, projection, transference, and communication are part of the reparative processes to helping overcome the tragedy of man's psychic isolation from both the material realm and the outside world by the formation of an automatic inner world independent of the matrix. For an understanding of psychology of ambivalence, it is necessary to recognize how the initial dilemma between being protected and being exposed, between going back to childhood and growing up, can either be fortified toward greater ambivalences and consequent greater inattention, or gradually be conquered. I would bore the reader if I were to mention all the various influences discovered in clinical psychoanalysis that increases man's doubts and hesitation and make human adjustment more difficult. It is correct to speak of the oral, anal, and the genital roots of the ambivalence, but many other significant influences and crises, such as transitions from laying to the erect position, teething, the advent of speech, and the birth of creative play, would be bypassed if all these were what were considered. Attainment of the erect posture by the child, and especially his walking away from his parents, may arouse some ambivalent feelings in both parent and child. Clinically, we find this dilemma of walking erect and facing the world alone, hidden behind manifold complaints about backache. The parents, in their need to be overprotective, may be, in a subtle way, hostile to their child because protection, especially overprotections, means reducing the self-assertive capacity of the protected person. As long as the child is laying passively in his crib, he gets affection. But the moment he begins to walk around and ask for extra attention and competes with the parents' movements in space, strange hostilities may be aroused in the parents. Important for our subject, especially in the behavioral cultural experiences and conflicting interaction, superimposes upon the condition inappropriate biological patterns of adjustment. For instance, an enforced feeding schedule can change the healthy biological need into an unhealthy refusal to be fed, which finally may result in a stomach ulcer, and so on. Only within the last decade has the influence of the initial conditioning of innate biological patterns of adaptation Only within the last decade has the influence of initial conditioning of innate biological patterns of adaptation been studied. Both the anthropologist and the anatomist have shown that man, in comparison with other animals, leaves the womb in the less developed state. Consequently, man is much more dependent on the parental care than any other animal. Being born means for the undeveloped and fertilized infant unequivocal burden of biological needs. The need for immediate warm body contact with the mother is, for instance, frustrated on the basis of too civilized pattern full of prejudice and taboos. Baby clothes usually symbolizes, paradoxically, distance from the mother. Innate biological needs of feeling are not met. Usually no breastfeeding takes place during the first 24 hours of life, which are highly important to the adaptive interaction between the mother and the child. During the last few years, we have learned how the first feeding frustration may condition an animal to develop meek, stereotyped, even compulsive behavior, which is easily conditioned into submissive automatic behavior. From clinical experience, Bagler has offered convincing evidences on how early in life the pattern of passivity, meekness, and psychic masochism are resulting from oral frustration, displaces the pattern of more active adaptation, bringing a basic self-destructive, injustice-collecting attitude in its wake. The baby goat needs only to be prevented in the first 3-hour period of its life from the contact with the leaking mother goat for it to be either completely rejected and consecrated to die or to be changed into a machistic, meek animal. Cultural behavior patterns are usually conditions during critical phases of development, especially in the first 3 years of life. In early infancy, during the so-called oral or feeding phase of the development, the womb is the principal organ of adaptation. In early infancy, during the so-called oral or feeding phase of development, the mouth is the principal organ of adaptation. The mouth tastes reality through acceptance or by refusal of what does not taste good. Oral incorporation, however, is an ambivalent function because it may symbolize a passive suffering of the world, especially when forced feeding coerces the biological needs. In such cases, the child suffers the world with all its limitations and deprivations. The so-called autoerotic personality remains dependent on things being shoveled into his mouth. He always wants to be given to and to take in. Man's ambivalence may increase when the gratifying object, the breast of the mother or its substitute, the bottle, however, the smothering and frustrating thing when the infant is fed, for instance, without the simultaneous giving of warmth and affection. Many a mother makes food a means of dominating, bribing and manipulating her child. The dilemma of the two-holler or the swallow is the way Jelliffe depicts his ambivalence fortifying period of life. The mother, who is herself rooted in ambivalent feelings about her child, keeps the baby caught in an alternative wave of protection and rejection. This continues the initial symbiotic tie with the child, which therapeutically nearly unbreakable when the adult later on comes into treatment with its overdependency. It should be especially recognized that the oral function of swallowing and incorporation may become a source of ambivalent feelings and adaptation as a result of too early voluntary control and consequently reduction of warmth and affections, such as through not only feeding on demand but on schedule only at time when the organism is hypersensitive coercive conditioning stimuli. The mechanical role takes over the biological need. Intrusion into biological needs happen when more in our world of plenty where the culture of oral gratification as a bribe for feelings of dissatisfaction is overemphasized. In the ancient intuitive expression about man's ambivalence, maternal domination or the fantasy of either devouring or being swallowed up plays an important role. Eat or be beaten is the rule of the jungle. In the dreams of children, many fantasies about devouring ogres are found. The engulfing whale and the white goddess is known of many mythologists. Baal, the bisexual bull god, swallows up the firstborn child of her, in order to secure the fertility of the mother and the father earth. Tentatively, we now can define ambivalence as the short, condensed vacillation of early feelings expressing themselves in a seeming coexistence of opposing tendencies. All this does not mean that the initial fears and dilemmas cannot be used as a change for individual advantage. The vacillating feelings of the child's coping with intruding reality influences ego formation. What Hartman calls the neutralizing emotion investment and catharsis of ego is the formation of consistent strategy that not only learns to cope with reality and incorporates reality, but also keeps in a mental distance, and thus reduces the vacillation of feelings and reactions. Winning is not mere deprivation. When done at the appropriate time, the renunciation of instincts challenges the ego to take distance from its own limitations and grow. Anal magic and doubt. In our clean culture of bathroom and shower, the subject of anal symbolism rouses strange resistance. Yet, when we go back to the paintings in the late Middle Ages, we see how accepting people were in those days with the showing of anal functions. In general psychology, we have become more and more familiar with the concept of innate eliminate pressures which the child experiences while moving his bowels. But this can turn into a sadist soiling pressure, a hostile and defiant act against the regulation and the restrictions by the parent. The key to the problem is the parent's illogical attitude toward dirt and shame. If they train the child too early, without giving the child any comprehension of their aim, the child's character may become stubborn and defiant, while at the same time, the automatic rule of cleanliness imposed by the parents may be followed by an absurdum. Defiant overdoing of the command is well-known passive Liberian's attitudes full of submission and sarcasm. An ambivalent sprinter strategy develops. The child feels dirty and hostile inside, but keeps the anal muscles tight in order to be clean and apparently innocent looking from the outside. The imposed rule becomes the child's aim and enemy at the same time. He wants to obey and defies the obedience. The anus may remain the neutral outlet, or they quite paradoxically become a body opening for defense against hostile mechanical intrudes such as emis and cleaning hands. The anus becomes a janitor of the body with a double morality. Shall I keep the doors open or shall I keep the doors closed? We find this so well expressed in the Dutch verb to doubt, arzen, meaning, shall I or shall I not keep it in my bowel? The loss of stool can become magic occurrences combined with the feeling of being lost to oneself. Because every loss symbolizes the earlier departure from the mother, all of this is known from the psychoanalytic explorations. Nevertheless, it remains a riddle why periods of scheduling, weaning, and toilet training belong to the most important condition factors for the persistence of doubt, ambivalence, and paradoxicality. It is not the training as such as important, but the illogical and the coercive way it is done by the fantasies the child consequently weaves around the parent's physical and the mental intrusion into the natural body functions. Mechanical intrusion into the body functions usually makes the organs more passive. In the child's fantasy, the anus may have acquired a passive or receptive sexual functions. The persistence of these needs explains some forms of homosexual fantasy. There may be different reasons for making the organism passive and dependent. 1. First, the anal function is a mixed involuntary and voluntary function, and as such it's biologically related to the action of contrasting neutral patterns. Related to the action of contrasting neural functions. The intrusion of too early training strictens by the parents can disrupt the gradual establishment of the natural biological regulation by making the function of precursely voluntarily. The combination of oral deprivation and anal coercions may easily lead to what resembles schizophrenic withdrawal. The child is forced to precociously compulsive automatic regulations, thus giving up the more easily quicable biological autonomy and involuntary self. Some parents even go as far as that they expect the baby to have a bowel movement before he is fed, which is biologically the feeling arouses evacuation reflex. This coercive inversion of function may arouse the most vehement rage and frustration in the child. By analogy with the feedback mechanism, we can now conclude that the excess of controlling energy has to be spent by such precocious precisions and compulsive regulation. The defensive encapsulation of the schizophrenic, this automatism and the stereotype actions preserve him from too much expenditure of externally directed energy because of all that is needed for inner regulation. By analogy with the feedback mechanism, we can now conclude that the excess of controlling energy has to be spent for such precocious precision and compulsive regulations. The defensive encapsulation and the schizophrenic, his automatism and the stereotypes actions, preserve him from too much expenditure of externally directed energy because of all that is needed for inner regulation. In the second place, a rudimentary biological function of the anal testing gets disturbed. Soiling is not only defiance or attack, but also part of the magic strategy of taking possession of Mother Earth. Just as dogs still do, in soiling trees and barking afterwards, dogs communicate to their competitors. Here is my tree, my field, and my dominion of living, and you stay out. The more primarily oral testing of the world, putting every object into the mouth, is gradually displaced with the child by anal testing and fetishistic creative taking possession of the environment. Evacuation is enlarging one's world and making magic possession of the environment. Adults, though soiling with words, find out how far they can go in conversation, using obscene words and telling dirty stories. Many a dirty joke represent a form of anal magic possessiveness. May I introduce my unconscious to you? And also it means, please show yours to me. 3. In the third place, order and neatness symbolizes the fight against chaos and confusion, which are unconsciously identified with death and decay. In the infertile, unly-oriented period of life, body products and mind products are not yet experienced as different scenarios. In the infertile, unly-oriented period life, the body products and mind products are not yet experienced as different secretions. The mysterious transformation of food into present feelings and colorful production is part of the magic philosophy of the child. This is why there is fear of losing control and autonomy, also the opposite fear of being left empty and lifeless after evacuation. The symbolic meaning of man's hesitation to show his dark inside was very early understood by the artist. The paintings of Jimenez Bosch, the 16th century painter, are full of the anal symbols. Devils come out of human body or try to get in. The most fantastic stories are woven around this unusual, unknown, and unseen part of the body. In my collection, I have a Japanese image for this anal ambivalence. Shall men keep it out or push it out? Man's hermaphrodite past. That I give in this short survey less attention to the genital and the bisexual roots of man's doubts and ambivalence because most people are already familiar with these concepts. As cited earlier, the mythical concept of sexual differences and mutual attraction is that originally man and woman are undivided beings and were separated. Since then, Adam has been searching for his Eve. In the child's identification with the imitation of his parents, one parent may also be too dominant and influence the sex identification in the wrong way. The bisexual analogy of every human being may become for some people a source of tremendous confusion. These people have greater difficulty in deciding whether to stand in their sexuality. The impact of early sexual conflicts on self-doubt and hesitation is tremendous. Emotional vacillation between the two parents and the impact of the odious complex are clinical facts was experienced overwhelmingly in daily psychotherapy. A too early sexual awareness, witness of the primo sense, involvement in the parent's passion and the hostile aggression may lead it to intensified ambivalent attitude. Children often take their parents' rage and hostility too literally, as if real murder were taking place. The mystery of the sex act is transmitted to the child simultaneously as unconscious pressure and excitement and conscious horror. Hence, an early and artificial dichotomy develops between the unconscious pleasure in sin and conscious horror of the sexual act. This double attitude may continue in many later nightmares. Ritual prejudice and Janus worlds. I wish to call attention to some social factors influencing and directing our contrasting feelings. Freud showed how the process of human communication outwardly betrays the influence of long-forgotten ancestors. How language and speech contain the condensed history of mankind. Words and ambiguous concepts divide men and push them into various, often contrasting interpretation and explanation of terms. The very words we speak are the conglomeration of unconscious and conscious meanings dependent on personal encounters with words and the history of the race. They are always approximate in meaning, and our communications serve both revelation and defensive hiding, expression as well as camouflage. Consequently, words like dreams have a manifest meaning and latent hidden meaning. This is why we can find many words remnants of original contrasting meaning. The word taboo, for instance, means holy but also unclean. The French sacré musique means damned music, while musique sacrée means holy music. Caldo originally meant cold as well as warm. Hostile is related to host. The Latin altus means both deep and high. It depends on where one stands. In every human communication outwardly still something in the historical antagonistic feelings that once were associated with it. The word is a revelation of emotion, but through the sublimation and sterilizations, a simultaneous hiding and changing of the original affects their place. Words can finally become an empty fetish. People may mouth concepts without really knowing and understanding them. Those who, for instance, say peace do not always mean peace. War in Latin was called euphemistically bellum, while it was not bellum, i.e. beautiful at all. For better understanding of the ambivalence in every communication, we have to go back to the study of archaic biological defenses science. Even the rudimentary biological communication seen in the skin signals of man is ambivalent in its expression. The skin is one part of oneself and part of the outer world. It may send out signals of warning and threat, and at the same time, it detects and perceives stimuli from the outer world. It attempts both overt expression and camouflage. A skin disease called fear melanosis shows man chameleon-like camouflage. Itching and scratching can be enjoyment and punishment at the same time. The same way he said to the various forms of involuntary movements, which represent action and restraint of action simultaneously. ties those strange electro-automatic movements people ultimately produce often express a narrow battle between passivity and activity. Man's gestural language communicates drive and defense against the instinctual drive intermingled with symbolic distortion of the original meaning. The military salute, for instance, initially intended for covering the eyes, meaning, I am not worthy of looking at my superiors. In many forms of the social intercourse and conversation, hidden ambivalence may come out to the fore. Punning, irony, and repartee often make use of the opposite meanings of words in order to overcome the incongruity between inner drive and the psychic defenses and do destimulative inner conflict. On the other side, expresses the subjective emptiness caused by the neutralizing crash of the antagonistic motives. In social ritual, mankind tries to get away from the ambivalent human relations and resulting from mutual hostilities. Freud and his students have described some totem, taboo, and ritual have to become symbolic instruments in the service of overcoming these ambivalent relations, while prejudice and scapegoatism unwittingly serve to keep the polarity intact. The scapegoat is always much more victim of the man's hidden hostility than that of the overt ones. We may apply this knowledge of inherent polarities not only to the individual but also to the emotional behavior of groups. After periods of social stress, the tension of ambivalent feelings inside a community increases. On the other hand, there arises an attempt to solve problems with apparent intelligence over rationalization of power in fewer hands. On the other hand, hidden emotional and mythical thinking come from more and more for more. Hidden emotional and mythical thinking come more and more to the fore. We experience both these manifestations in totalitarianism. I am convinced that in future psychology and integration of physical, biological, and socio-psychological factors will be more strongly emphasized. Yet the solution of man's hidden antinomies and ambivalences in mutual human relation will be elusive for some time to come. Ultimate knowledge of the abyss of man's psyche and subtle control of contrasting forces in and around man will be needed. Overcoming inner doubt and ambivalences is rather difficult, as we have seen in the treatment of people with compulsion neurosis, who suffer from too much automatic restraint and enact repeated rituals to keep their hostile defiance in check. There exist, in general, two ways to evade the tension of ambivalence, either regression or to a pre-ambivalent time back to the imagery symbiosis with mother and back to the passive dependency, or progression to the controlled acceptance of inner antinomies under the guidance of the ego and the superego. Awareness of the inherent contrast within all men is usually achieved in the redundant action of the therapeutic working through. The awareness of inner polarity receives the patient from fear of the ticking bomb, internalized hatred and guilt, and from the fear of losing control. He learns to accept the repressed and the formerly denied hostile part of his personality. In accepting his range, he grows beyond range. Awareness of repressed hatred and hostility sets energy free to love and to accept one's fellow man. Hostility freed during the therapeutic hour makes the greater capacity to love outside the therapeutic setting. That does not mean that people, after catharsis of their hostilities, will not vacillate in their feeling and in their decision, but they may come to accept more and more the dignity of doubt and drop their defenses in fertile self-pity and failure policy. Still, the therapeutic setting itself involves inherent doubt and ambivalence because many of the patients feel he is setting words instead of bread. Distanciation, verbalization, and control instead of direct pressure and gratification. The relationship with the therapist and the transference teaches the patient denial and sublimation of wishes at the same time. Therapy is a trial relationship through which they develop the capacity of real human relationships. The contrasting activities of therapists and patients become apparent in their differences in attitude toward reality. The patient tries to understand the direct reality according to his personal myth of life. What we call the psychic processes of illusion, projection, and transference are the continual mythicization of reality because of the desire to keep an infertile image alive. The therapist, however, aims at the realization of the myth, which means that he tries to counteract the patient's compulsion to repeat infertile patterns and to make him continually aware of the unrealistic transformation of reality. Conscious knowledge and contrasting forces and feelings does not immediately help to establish a stable balance. A passive acceptance of ambivalence, inner doubt, and plurality does not lead people out of the dilemma at once. To overcome these autonomies, people must grow more sure of existing values and must establish a goal in their lives. Self-confidence is dependent on active internal and social adaptations. The basis of all this purposeful behavior is the integration of accepting and rejecting approaches, the integration of pros and cons. Monovalent and straightforward behavior may be called sublimated ambivalences. Conquered doubt leads to new wisdom. The gradual transition from ambivalence and doubt into monovalence depends on absorption and adaptation of value systems from the environment and under the control of maturing, expanding ego that is gaining in poise and strength. The person of the therapist and the system of values direct the value adaptation of patient, for the therapeutic trial relation is a medium of establishing new inner values. Sometimes it will be a priest or a friend who teaches the principle of free maturity of exchange. A continued and consistent dedication to moral principles, a commitment to religious social ethics, when used to mask and defense, help canalize man's antinomies and social feelings. 2. Creative art helps the process of sublimation and acceptance. Music has an ambivalence solving actions, so does the cathartic empathy with the dramatic play. Music forces one into experience of the composer who harmonizes rhythm and counter-rhythm, who reconciles seemingly incomparable elements, who repeats the modulus, who creates from the sympathy and contrast of the counterpoints an integrated emotional expression. After attending a concert, we are more ready to accept the world and its antinomies. Integration of inner contrast is related to the formation of new habits in which old ambivalent vacillation, retardation, and delay are speeded up in straight monovalent action. This in itself is the result of the newly acquired inner security under the influence of a straight-headed ego that experiences itself as a feeling, thinking, and acting autonomous unit. The psychological outlook of man's inner antinomies is that the reasonable doubt is the basis of feelings and thinking. Convictions are built up of contrasting principles. Presumably those most adapted to outer circumstances will win if no neurotic interferences takes place. Security officials searching for inner doubt in people will always find it. No loyalty exists without hidden disloyalties. Moral cleanliness in politics may be an illusion if it denies the contrasting background of every motivation. Everybody has a corruptible qualities as everybody once had dirty diapers. The problem is how to check the corruptible qualities, or better, how to have multiple checks as a negative component of man's character qualities. Moral versus immoral is a relative approach to politics, more a form of name-giving than true ethical evaluation. The question is how much the general public and how much the politicians are aware of their hidden immorality. Being a member of the favored clan and group in power does not make a man good. Moral fervor and moral emphasis in politics try to make into crusade that which is a result of many contrasting components. Idealism may distinguish brutal hostility, while practical cynicism may hide wounded kindness of heart. Man can do the same things based on contrasting motivation, doing the wrong thing for the right reason and the right thing for the wrong reason. The synthesis of all these antinomies can be found in the democratic government that offers a system of multiple checks of the various evils that come up from the netherworld of man motivations. There exists a principal difference between the scope of diversity of man's inner motivation and convictions and the consistent straightforwardness of man's actions. The whole problem of loyalty and mutual trust is a problem of steadiness of man's actions, not of beliefs and convictions. The psychological concept of freedom concentrates on understanding of contrasting influences which man has to choose. This man's reasonable compromises we call maturity. His freedom of choice lies between what is done and what can be done. Such freedom means knowledge in life potentialities and possibilities. The freedom of one man to shout is for other person the compassion to listen. Freedom is never a mere unrestrained emotional outlet, but an understanding and adjustment of the limitations of unfreedom. Janus laughs at one-sided truth. In this survey of man's inner polarities, I first showed how in the history of mankind in nearly every culture, an intuitive knowledge was expressed in the two-faced Janus figure, in which both masculinity and femininity are expressed as good and evil, or the duality of man-conscious and unconscious tendencies. Next, we encountered the continued battle between constructive and destructive forces, the battle between living structuralizations and decay. Later, we saw that behind every emotional reaction hides the existence tension between progression and regression, between spontaneity and compulsion. If the steering captain of the mind, the ego, is not strong or experienced enough to conquer the internal contrast. Practically speaking, we may say that man's ambivalent or better prevalent feelings are related to life-death polarity, to the male-female antinomy, and to the lust and lust, good-evil, and love and hate duality. They are all connected with the continued infatuation and interrelation between body and mind, between beauty and chaos, between instincts and reason, and they will all determine how man's knowledge and science will be used for the good of the highest culture or for the total destructions. Man has to live the life of an intellectually self-aware being and has to be familiar at the same time with the irrational animal part of himself. We may look into contempt at man and his inner contrast because we are directing our gaze backward, observing only his infertile fallacies and primitive qualities. Yet we can also look at him with a simple optimism and his promises, ideals and anticipations. Janus looks both backward and forwards. But at the proper distance of scientific observation, we see man battle beyond those highly diverse and contrasting inner forces. In conquering ambivalence, he finds a stabilized harmony and contrast. The ancient Greek school of cause and needles lived in perpetual theoretical battle because they could not accept the existence of different clinical truths. At the same time, we are now better able to tolerate coexistence of different concepts because we have become aware of the value of different approaches, and additionally, modern psychology has drawn attention to the subjective motivation of ourselves in those who fight our theories. This conscious switch between one's own motivation of the motivation of other fellow and the attempt to take them both into account initiate the conquest of man antinomies, with two faces of Janus united in the beautiful face that indicates mature man. End of chapter 8.